Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Basma Alloush, the Policy and Advocacy Advisor at the Norweigan Refugee Council, and Alex Simon, the Director of the Syria Program with Synaps. And today I wanted to talk about an issue that, at least on my Twitter, is going around as a debate, which is the expected implementation of Caesar sanctions on Syria, and we'll get into what they're linked to. And you two wrote a great piece for War on the Rocks, a friend of the podcast, which we'll link to in the show notes below. Will more Syria sanctions hurt the very civilians they aim to protect? So I thought we could unpack that a little bit on the show today. So hello and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Alex, maybe I'd start with you, and maybe because we were talking a little bit off podcast about sort of what the sanctions mean, where they came from, and what they're intended to do within the context of Syria.
Well, so when we talk about sanctions in Syria, it's important to have in mind that they're not a new tool. In fact, we've been sanctioning this very regime in Syria for decades, going back to the 80s or possibly even 79. I'm not sure when exactly the first one was, but sanctions on Syria have been piling up in layers for decades. There were new ones in 2000, and then there were many more new ones in the 2000s, and then there were many more new ones starting in 2011 with the outbreak of the uprising in Syria and subsequently the violent crackdown on it. So from the beginning in 2011, the objective of sanctions, along with other aspects of American policy, has been to ratchet up pressure on the Assad regime in Damascus, with the end goal of forcing a political transition, or as time has gone on and a political transition per se has seemed less likely, with kind of more incremental goals. So focusing on the UN political process and other kind of sub objectives. But the most recent sanctions are part of a continuum that goes back years, all of which are intended to extract concessions from this regime.
And Basma, this leads to something that we were talking to about, off the podcast before I hit record here, which is, if you were to be following this, and the debate is often sort of cast in black or white terms, i.e. the sanctions will, it's implied in the title, the Ryan shows over at War on the Rocks, will the sanctions hurt civilians, or will the sanctions, hurt the regime? And all this debate is going on. So maybe you can, expand a little bit about your thoughts on that, about whether it's, sort of this black or white, this binary if or debate.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, you really summed it up well there. The sanctions, sanctions have become kind of a tool to do something in Syria, to have some kind of policy, and it's become this default policy that policymakers have turned to. But what we were trying to do with our article is to kind of bring a bit of nuance, a few shades to that discussion, where we can be for justice, for accountability. The war that's taken place in Syria right now for almost a decade has really decimated the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. So there absolutely needs to be a call for justice and accountability. But sometimes the call just falls short of concrete measures, and sanctions become the default tool to use. And the conversation then becomes, if you're for sanctions, then you're for justice and accountability. And if you're anti-sanctions, then you're willing to forgive the crimes that have happened on Syrian ground. And what I would say is, sanctions, yes, are a tool within the toolbox that we can use. But I think we need to have an honest and open conversation about what these sanctions actually do and how we can sharpen this tool so that it really yields to the change, to to the positive change that we're looking for. We can't just say, let's just slap on a bunch of sanctions and then assume that all the change that we're looking for, that we're working towards, is automatically going to happen. We're saying that, yes, these are things that could be used, but we really need to nuance it in a way where we look at the potential harm and the unintended consequences that these sanctions could have, and ways that we can protect, ways that we can safeguard, so that, if the Syria Civilian Protection Act is indeed going to protect, that we actually fulfill that mandate, right? And it's not just, using rhetoric and just claiming that, mission accomplished by having Caesar pass.
Yeah, I mean, maybe either one of you can just discuss like who Caesar, is, for people who are, tuning into the show and don't know all that much about the history of what this person did and sort of the genesis of these sanctions. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Caesar is a pseudonym for or a nom de guerre for a Syrian man that was in the Syrian military. He was a military photographer, and he ended up defecting and smuggling out over 55,000 photographs of not just political, but prisoners that were detained in the Syrian government prisons, and they were tortured. All of them were tortured to death, and his job was to take photos of the corpses. And so his smuggling of these photos is considered, one of the largest pieces of evidence we have on the brutalities and the crimes that have occurred in the prisons in Syria.
And so what I just add to that is that the link between Caesar's defection and presentation of these tens of thousands of horrific photos and this bill itself is that there's been a certain conflation of war crimes on one side and sanctions as a tool to combat those war crimes on the other. So for the last several years, and Basma will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Caesar's genesis goes back to 2016 to 2014, in fact. So it's part of a really long-running effort to translate the West's growing awareness of how horrendous this regime is into action against it. And so this gets to what Basma was saying about this kind of binary in which being for sanctions is for accountability. And those who are on the really hard line of that discussion will sometimes imply that being against sanctions is being against accountability, when in fact there's much need for a serious discussion about the degree to which these or any other sanctions will actually promote accountability for, say, the people who were responsible for torturing to death all of these people who were photographed.
Yeah, and I think sort of the backdrop for the sanctions have changed. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first time this type of legislation, Caesar legislation, was written or drafted was a couple of years ago. It took some time to work its way through the process within Congress. And I think what's changed in that time period, and particularly has accelerated over the past couple of months or even weeks, has been just the sort of outgrowth of COVID-19 pandemic, the outgrowth of the global slowdown economically, is that the Syrian economy, which probably was never all that good, is now probably the worst it's ever been. So, in the regime-controlled areas, they're experiencing economic blight in ways that they probably haven't experienced ever. So, can you explain maybe how that fits into the debate going on now? Is that piling on more sanctions will just make the people who live in regime-held areas, most of which obviously weren't involved in the war crimes, may be negatively affected by some of the provisions in Caesar?
Yeah. So I think, before getting into the latest deterioration, I think it's important to bear in mind that first of all, things were very bad even before Caesar passed. And even before COVID. So they've been bad for a long time, and they started to deteriorate progressively more and more rapidly starting around the middle of last year, and then really went off a cliff in October 2019, coinciding with the uprising in Lebanon and the banking crisis that followed shortly thereafter. So what's at the core of that is a very serious cash crunch. Syria, along with neighboring Lebanon, are running out of dollars, and as a result, the Syrian currency is just plummeting. So I forget what the number is, but it's lost some terrifying percentage of its value over the last 9 months. I think it's probably been quartered or even more than quartered. I think it went from 500 around the middle of last year to about 2,800 today. So the currency has broken, and as a result, the population has been ever more hard pressed to buy basic goods as prices are rising at the same time. And then you also have subtler but also extremely ominous effects. For example, the fact that Syria now faces a very serious medicine shortage, because it's long been very difficult for Syria to import medicine from Western countries, because pre-existing sanctions that don't have anything to do with Caesar already made it very difficult to transact internationally in dollars. And so Syria was already having to manufacture much of its medicine domestically, but now it can't even import the raw materials that it needs to manufacture medicine. So you now have a situation where pharmacies are running out of basic medical supplies. So essentially, the country has gone off a cliff in which people are increasingly heading towards. They are going hungry. But people throw around the word famine. There's real danger of people beginning to die from lack of medication and other forms of deprivation. So it's an incredibly dire situation that hasn't factored in enough into how we think about what the impact of these new sanctions will be.
And Aaron, I think something that is something we have to keep in mind and to keep centered to this discussion is the fact that the civilians that we're asking to live under these Caesar sanctions, and the sanctions that have been imposed since 2011, are the same civilians that have lost so much and have barely managed to survive throughout almost a decade of conflict, have completely depleted their resources to stay alive, only for now to start, enduring this new wave of pain, of suffering, and the burden that we're asking for them to handle is honestly unfair. And I think, speaking to family members that are stuck in Syria that didn't leave, that barely had resources to flee, asking them, speaking to them about ways that they're able to survive. When you have a family member saying, "I don't remember the taste of meat," that's very jarring. And in 2020, to have people endure that and go through that, especially in a country that, prior to the conflict was surviving, was somewhat self-sustainable, and they've endured years of violence, and the trauma that they've experienced, to now say, okay, you might be safe from violence, but you're not going to be safe in the sense that you're not going to have any security, any ability to provide for your children, any ability to provide for your families. I believe that's a really unfair burden that we're asking them to take on. And even though I personally don't question the intention that went behind the Caesar Act, but I do think that there needs to be more concrete safeguards so that these very civilians are not further, impacted by this conflict and now the results of what, the policies that have come out of this conflict.
And just the one thing that I think it's critical to add as a caveat is that neither of us means to imply that sanctions per se are responsible for this economic misery.
Absolutely, yeah.
By far and away the primary culprit for how bad things have become in Syria is the Syrian regime, which has been systematically destroying its own infrastructure for the last 9 years, systematically detaining, killing, and sending into exile its human capital, and now is increasingly living off increasingly innovative forms of plunder, where it loots whatever wealth of any kind is left in the country. So it's very much it's very much a homemade crisis in the sense that the regime is the most culpable for what's happening, but sanctions then until now have added another layer to the crisis more than they've addressed the problem.
There are two sort of layers to Caesar, right? So there are sanctions sort of against the Syrian regime, but there's also the threat of sanctions, so-called secondary sanctions upon people who do transactions with them. And I believe that those have a 5-year sort of sunset, to use the term in vogue, where these provisions would come up for renewal. My guess is that was put in there to address sort of the frequent criticism of U.S. sanctions is that once you place them, they never can come off because they become very, very sticky. That's one. And then two, maybe both of you could talk about who the secondary sanctions may most impact. There still are countries that, despite the sanctions that were mentioned at the top, I think by Alex, that were still under the radar or surreptitiously doing business with the regime because that's what certain countries and companies do.
Well, so I can start with the second one on who secondary sanctions are most likely to affect. Well, so I think it's important to say that nobody knows exactly how this law will be implemented. It's incredibly ambitious and vast in its scope. So we'll have a better sense tomorrow once the initial round of designations is rolled out. But from how things stand now, it seems likely that the most important impact of secondary sanctions will be in terms of deterring any new investment or even transactions between people outside Syria and people inside. So that largely relates to, or is most likely to have an impact on regional countries. So Lebanon is a big one. Lebanon's economy has historically been incredibly closely bound up with Syria's. Arab Gulf states are also important insofar as, say, Emirati businessmen, as of a year or two ago, appeared to be eyeing opportunities to get into Syria's post-war market. So these types of actors will have to think much harder about whether it's worth the risk of losing their access to the dollar market in order to go into Syria in search of uncertain returns and with huge amounts of risk. And I think most will on its face deem it not worth it. The other thing that it's important to keep in mind is the Syrian diaspora. So you have quite a large contingent of Syrian business people in exile who often are quite wealthy. Many have second citizenships. Most or all probably have business interests abroad, and those again are people who might consider wading back into Syria, say, to work on some kind of infrastructure project in their home neighborhood, for example, who now would look at that with a great deal more anxiety because of the risk that setting foot in that increasingly heavily sanctioned market could cut them off from their business opportunities abroad. And then the other point that it's critical to keep in mind is that secondary sanctions will affect even parties who they're not intended to affect. And so this relates to what's called overcompliance, where people and businesses avoid doing even legal activities for fear that they might trip up and do something wrong or something that's allegedly wrong and wind up sanctioned by the U.S. So this will affect even, say, Lebanese banks who work with business people or NGOs in Lebanon who do work in Syria, because they'll become increasingly anxious that these new sanctions might wind up hitting them because they're banking for somebody who puts money into Syria. So the ripple effects will be quite wide and will go well beyond who they're ostensibly targeting.
I mean, just quickly on the over-compliance, it's not just the businesses that are going to be impacted, but it's also organizations that are trying to help Syrians inside the country as well, where, humanitarian organizations are currently already experiencing delays in being able to fund programs, to pay staff, to procure. And so that, additional sanctions are going to create a stronger kind of over-compliance environment where businesses and banks will also be more reluctant to work with organizations that operate in government-controlled areas that are trying to provide the goods and services needed for the civilians that have remained.
I'm going to ask the final question here, just because I'm just, I'm going to steal from your piece and then ask it back to you guys to maybe expand a little bit. So these sanctions, we're recording this on Tuesday. It's about 9 a.m. The sanctions, at least, some of the implementation measures from the Treasury should be released tomorrow, Wednesday. Given our conversation, Basma, I think you probably wrote this in your co-authored piece, is that, sanctions are Washington's primary source of leverage. However, leverage is only useful when paired with a clear and realistic overall strategy. What did you, both of you, what did you mean by that? And what's the way forward here? So, when sanctions are, sort of officially announced tomorrow, sort of the implementation measures of the sanctions are officially announced tomorrow, what then? What's the best way forward, and what's the best way to think about it for listeners who, may not be following it all that closely, but are certainly interested in the future of Syria?
I think, Aaron, the intention behind that comment or that part of the article is that we don't want sanctions. We don't want the Caesar Act to just be a box checking exercise. We don't want it to just be, we passed this massive piece of legislation. It took a lot of work, and it's a bipartisan issue in the U.S. And so now we can sit back and let the sanctions do their work. I think what's really required right now is that we need the bureaucratic infrastructure, so to speak, to really be very, meticulous, to be very concrete, to be very monitor closely the implementation of these sanctions, but also have honest conversations about ways that the U.S. can prevent some of these sanctions hurting people unintentionally. And some of these mitigations include, looking at the humanitarian exemption. It was great that we have that part in the piece. In the legislation. It's great that they carved out a humanitarian exemption. But what does that actually mean? How is that going to look like? Who is it going to impact? And how can people apply to it? Basically, the Caesar sanctions are a way to dissuade, the secondary sanctions component is very prevalent in the Caesar Act. And yet organizations that are non-US entities operating in Damascus have very limited opportunities to seek any recourse to safeguard against these sanctions. So you can't apply for licenses as a non-US entity. You can't apply for exemptions as a non-US entity. So how is the US going to ensure that non-US organizations operating out of Damascus are protected under this act? And what are the measures that the US is willing to take that will ensure that the small business owner in Lebanon or neighboring countries is not discouraged from, carrying out business with non-sanctioned entities in Syria? How are you going to ensure that the goods that are needed, especially during a pandemic, are actually, flowing unrestrictedly? How are you going to ensure that the services that are needed for civilians, services needed for ordinary Syrians are provided in a way that meets the needs that they have on the ground? So all of these things, we're proposing, we're putting them out there so that we can have a discussion. And I hope that this yields to a discussion, to a fruitful discussion, where we're not calling for the Caesar Act to be repealed. And now this is one of the tools we have at hand. How can we sharpen this tool to make it more effective, to make it, more, to protect, so that it actually provides the accountability, so that it provides the justice, and it does, protect Syrians that it's intended to protect.
Yeah, and so I totally agree with everything Basma laid out. I'd add just a few points. One, I think it's useful to go back to the point that I made initially about the degree to which Caesar really is it's a continuation of the policies that we've had in place since 2011. And if we look back at those policies, we've continually maintained an approach whereby we invest as little as we feel we can get away with in Syria, while purporting to seek really maximalist aims. So if you look at the Obama years, Syria policy was defined by piecemeal support to opposition factions, along with escalating sanctions, and then diplomacy that it increasingly became clear wasn't going anywhere. And so what this ultimately amounted to was a policy of piecemeal escalation reflexively, where we must be doing something, and therefore we escalate along different tracks without ever matching the means that we're putting into Syria with the ends that we claim to be seeking. So Caesar to me is the exact same situation. And I was in Washington about a year ago having this conversation, and I was quite disturbed by the extent to which every conversation that I had felt like a rerun of past discussions about, like, well, we need to be doing something about Syria, so we'll do this. Which in the case of arming various factions amounted to escalating the military conflict without actually having a coherent strategy for achieving our objective there. And today, the way that I personally, and this is to speak for myself and not for Basma, but Caesar to me feels very much like a policy of economic escalation by default, which increasingly flirts with becoming collective punishment. So I haven't yet heard a single convincing argument that Caesar would achieve the aim of achieving a negotiated transition per this UN Security Council resolution that's always referred to in this conversation. And so that to me is the most troubling part of this whole discussion, is that there's been no convincing case made as to how this tool, which will fairly clearly have major negative ramifications for ordinary Syrians, would achieve what it's meant to be achieving. And so I'd just end on 3 points that I think are essential to kind of rationalizing this conversation, 2 of which Basma covered quite well. So one is just having a much more frank conversation about these issues than has been had until now. So the conversation in Washington simply and straightforwardly does not adequately account for the serious collateral damage that will come out of these sanctions. And that it makes it impossible to have a realistic conversation about what should be done to minimize that collateral damage. So that's kind of a prerequisite for anything in terms of making these sanctions more helpful and less harmful. 2 is, as Basma laid out very well, investing much more rigorously in making sure that the humanitarian exemptions work, and that's not just about. It's not just about kind of the various U.S. government bodies making themselves available to complaints from humanitarian actors. It also would entail significant investment in kind of the administrative capacity to do a better job with this than we have until now, and frankly than government bodies typically do with complex, fast-moving procedures. And on both of those points, the effort would have to come not just from the U.S. government, but also from humanitarians who until now have not, for the most part, been sufficiently clear and explicit in laying out exactly how sanctions interfere with their work. And then the last point that again I think is something of a prerequisite for any aspect of American policy to become more sensical is really about fine-tuning what we think of as our objectives in Syria. So fine, maybe we must continue speaking in the language of pursuing a negotiated transition. I think it's an essential and admirable goal. I'm absolutely would never advocate for any form of normalization with this regime, but it's not a realistic immediate term goal. So what can we focus on in the meantime that would make sanctions a more precise and kind of actionable tool? So it might be, say, institutionalizing a ceasefire in Idlib, and that's something that Moscow really controls at least as much as Damascus does. It might be really fighting for improved access for the aid apparatus, which is already in place, but tends to get bullied a bit by the regime. But so essentially, there needs to be that process of saying what exactly do we hope to get out of this leverage.
With that, Alex, Basma, thanks for joining me. Everybody, make sure to check out the piece. Just look down in the show notes. And thanks everybody for listening.